In this lesson, we'll introduce the reward system of the brain, and the particular neural pathways involved use the neurotransmitter called dopamine. Now, if we just think about a reward system, why would brains have reward systems? Well, it's an adaptation. Having a reward system is a solution to increase adaptive behavior. So rewards produce approach behavior, what we like, what we want, what we're going to spend energy on. It'll trigger learning about the things that bring these rewards. So it makes sense to have a system in the brain that attaches values to the various things that we encounter so that we can make wise decisions in the future. Now, the dopamine system is one of the principal components of the reward system, and it is the system affected by the drugs of abuse like cocaine and amphetamine and other drugs that produce euphoria. They all affect the dopamine system. They cause elevated levels of dopamine in the synapse. Now, some of the early research on the dopamine system involved rodents, like this rat here, and you can set up a system where the rat can self-administer injections of drugs, for example, cocaine or amphetamine, and they will work hard to self-administer these drugs that affect the dopamine system. You can also, instead of administering drugs that do this, you can stimulate dopamine cells directly. And again, when you set the system up so that the rat can choose to press a lever that will stimulate its own dopamine system, it will work very hard to press that lever. So rats, in a sense, can become addicts, just like humans. Rats will work hard to give self-stimulation in brain areas that release dopamine, and they're, in a sense, choosing to self-administer because they might be in a situation where if they press a different lever, they can get some other kind of rewarding stimulus, like food or water. They will choose to press the lever that administers either a drug like cocaine or directly stimulates the dopamine cells. In addition, chronic stress increases the self-administration. Interesting parallel to human behavior, where stress can increase abusive drug addict behavior. And some rats will, in fact, overdose. So they will give themselves too much of these drugs, or they will stimulate their dopamine system in such a way that they will, over time, become exhausted. They will not eat or drink, and they can die because stimulating the dopamine system itself is so rewarding. Now, natural stimuli lead to satiation, like when we get full, we stop eating. Unfortunately, the drugs that activate the dopamine system do not lead to satiation, so they artificially elevate dopamine so you can never get enough of them. Now, the dopamine neurons are located deep in the brain, but they send their axons to several important places. One, the amygdala. We've already seen the amygdala is like a salience detector, so things with emotional significance will activate the amygdala, and that makes sense. The reward system has an impact on the amygdala. Also up to the striatum. Now, this area of the brain is involved in sort of habit learning, and so it does also then make a sense that the reward system is going to be instrumental in forming habits, right? So it makes sense to form habits to do behaviors that get rewards, and we want to sort of wire that into our brain so that we can efficiently get rewards in the environment. So the dopamine system helps this part of the brain establish habits that bring rewards. And then, of course, it also sends axons up to the prefrontal cortex, regions of the brain that are involved in decision-making. And so it makes sense that the reward system is going to be a set of inputs to the decision-making machinery here. Now, the evaluation system of the brain, the parts of the brain that sort of attach values to things, includes other regions as well. Regions in the frontal cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate gyrus. Anterior cingulate cortex. We said the amygdala, orbitofrontal cortex, insula. These are nucleus accumbens. These are also areas of the brain involved in sort of attaching values to stimuli. But the dopamine system is a critical component of the system, so we'll focus on the behavior of dopamine neurons. So what does dopamine neural activity represent? It was once thought that dopamine activity represented pleasure. And so when dopamine cells were active, it was sort of encoding that somebody was liking something. That seemed to make sense because the drugs that make us feel good are stimulating the dopamine system. And other types of things that we enjoy that are pleasurable also seem to be activating the dopamine system. So this was the predominant view until more recently. Now the ventral striatum here, this is one of the key areas having dopamine neurons, respond to a wide variety of stimuli. And again, it sort of supports this idea that neurons were representing what we like. So for example, the dopamine system turns on to money stimuli, beautiful faces compared to others, sports cars compared to regular cars, pleasant music compared to background, humorous cartoons compared to informative cartoons, romantic love compared to the other person known for the same time. So in other words, in a wide variety of kinds of stimuli, the dopamine system can be turned on. And what do these all have in common? Well, there's some element of we like these things. So this was the old view then, that the dopamine activity here, and this is part of the striatum, just a region of the brain that has some of these dopamine neurons, that these parts of the brain here are representing liking. However, more recent research has revised this idea. The new view is that for certain dopamine neurons, activity in those neurons represents an error signal, a signal that represents that a stimulus is better than expected or worse, right? And we'll see in a moment here the idea of better than expected would be related to increased dopamine activity, and worse than expected would be related to decreased dopamine activity. So a better than expected signal would be useful to guide further learning and repeat the behavior that led to the reward, right? And so this gets us back to sort of forming habits. When we're in an environment where there are rewards that have some kind of regular basis, the brain then is going to sort of make habits to repeatedly and reliably and efficiently achieve those rewards. Now, dopamine system is also signaling risk, so almost related to the idea that something might be worse or could be worse in the future. So in a sense, dopamine activity can be tracking risk in a decision or a stimulus. So what is the evidence that dopamine is not really representing just pleasure per se, but rather it's representing better than expected, a kind of an error signal? Well, consider a simple paradigm where an animal is going to undergo a learning experience. Now the neuron here will be a dopamine neuron, and the little hash marks here will indicate action potentials. So if we were to just record from dopamine neuron when the animal's resting, we'll get some low baseline level of activity. Now notice now we're going to have a light come on in the environment. And the light does not alter the dopamine activity. By itself, that stimulus is not being registered by the reward system as having any particular significance. It's not a rewarding stimulus. But after the light comes a little squirt of juice into the animal's mouth. And here we see the increase in dopamine activity. Now this kind of finding supports the old idea that, well, juice was probably tasty and it was a pleasant experience and dopamine activity increases, so maybe dopamine activity is representing the pleasantness or pleasure, right, of the juice. But now consider the following. Now what we're going to do is we're going to repeatedly present the light followed by the juice. Light, juice, light, juice. You'll notice this is like a training procedure you might use in a classical conditioning paradigm. So the light followed by the juice, and do this several times. Now remember, previously the light did not increase dopamine activity, but the juice did. But look what happens after training, pairing the light and the juice. Now when the light comes on, the dopamine activity increases. But then when the juice follows, dopamine activity goes back to baseline. In other words, the juice previously was the one that showed increased dopamine activity. And we thought that maybe it was representing pleasure. But in this context now, it seems rather that the juice no longer is anything that is better than expected. It is the expected stimulus because the light has been paired with the juice. Now if the animal's just sitting around and the light comes on, that's better than expected because now it will anticipate the juice. So This line of research then suggested that the dopamine system is not tracking pleasure per se, but rather better than expected stimuli. Now, here's a quote from one of the researchers in the field, Reed Montague, and he says this concept of proxy value. He says, this shift of the burst response from the juice to the light is communicated by the widespread axons of the dopamine neurons, telling the rest of the brain to treat the light as though it carried the same intrinsic reward value as the juice, basically a proxy assignment scheme. Right, so in other words, now because of this pairing, it's as if the dopamine system now is attaching the value to the light because the light predicts the juice. Right, so if the animal again is just sitting around and the light comes on, that's a better than expected situation because it's now been associated with the juice to follow. He goes on, the light's consistent relationship to the juice gives your brain permission to let the light act as the proxy for juice, a value proxy, just like an option on a stock, something that stands for something that has value in the future. So the brain is solving a statistics problem here. It's constantly looking for stimuli that predict future value, and by doing so, the brain can use these value proxies to make better decisions about the future. Now, suppose we take this rat that's been trained on the light and the juice. So the rat is associating the light with the juice, and the rat is showing dopamine activity for the light but not the juice. But what if we now add a third component? What if we ring a bell before the light and then the juice? And we do this repeatedly. So now we have bell, light, juice, bell, light, juice, bell, light, juice. Now we look at dopamine activity, and here's what they found. When the bell turns on, when the bell rings, you get increased elevated dopamine activity here. And notice then when the light and also when the juice came, dopamine activity goes back to baseline. So in other words, we see here one further proxy. Now the bell stands for the value that was previously intrinsic to the juice and then shifted to the light. So here we see another shift. The value initially was in the juice, it got shifted to the light, and now it's being shifted to the bell. And the reason this makes sense for brains to do that is because when you shift the value to the bell, you're giving the brain more time, right, to make useful decisions. So by shifting the value back to the first thing that predicts the ultimate reward, that's an adaptive strategy for brains to do. You increase the amount of time between the onset of the valued stimulus and the actual thing that is the rewarding item. Again, Montague says, if there was a bell that consistently preceded the light, then the burst of activity would transfer all the way back to the bell, passing the light proxy's value back to the bell. After this further transfer, the dopamine system will only give a burst better than expected to the bell and will not change its activities to the subsequent light or juice. This too is efficient. Since both bell and light predict the same future reward, why bother making extra energy-consuming impulses to both predictors? This gives the system more time to prepare its actions, hence more time to avoid costly, energy-wasting decisions. In summary, then, the old view of the dopamine system has been revised. Nowadays, lots of researchers argue that the dopamine system is part of an error signal system where it is tracking better than expected or worse than expected. So it makes sense now if we think back to these other things that turn on the dopamine system. If you're just sitting in the fMRI scanner and a stimuli that represents money comes up, well, that's better than expected, right? Or a beautiful face, better than expected. A sports car, better than expected, etc. So the dopamine system is part of a reward system, and it is tracking better than expected with elevated activity and worse than expected with decreased activity. And then these dopamine signals are sent to other strategic parts of the brain to help the brain make good decisions in the future. And just one final comment about addiction then. So the drugs of abuse then are going to be activating the dopamine system in a way that then is going to be signaling the brain that the drug itself has incredible reward value, intrinsic value, and it will be then setting up habits to get the drug again on future occasions. It's going to be changing decisions. So the addicted brain is going to be making decisions to get that drug again, even at the cost of their job or their relationships or even their life. So the drugs of abuse are especially damaging because they are hijacking the reward system of the brain, which is so integral to making good decisions in one's environment.